Welcome everyone to Module 2. In this module we'll be considering the structure of a sentence and the reason we're doing that is because we're going to focus on common drafting errors. And yes, I know it feels like sitting in an English class at school and many of you will know most if not all of the rules. There may be some rules that you understand how to apply them but you're not quite sure of what rules underpin them, and I think there will be a little bit of learning on the way. So please bear with me. It's all part of the process of becoming a skilled drafter. The only way to ensure that you don't make common drafting mistakes is to understand the rules that underpin them rather than just being able to apply them. That means that you'll frequently look out for them when you're proofreading your work. So let's have a look at principal and subordinate clauses first. So it's important that we know that sentences can be made up of more than one clause. If a comma in a sentence or a conjunction such as and or are used, then you create a separate clause following the comma or the and or the or. Whether it is a principal or subordinate clause depends on the construction of that clause. So if a clause could be used in a sentence in its own right, it's a principal clause. Those that can't make sense on their own are known as subordinate clauses. So if you look at the sentence on the slide there, you can see the sentence, I prepared the document and then I served it on the defendant. There are two principal clauses here because both the clause that appears before the and has a subject, verb and an object, and then the clause that appears after the word and also has a subject, verb and object. So in the first part of the sentence, I is the subject, prepared is the verb, and the document is the object because that was the thing that was prepared or had or received the effect of the verb. And is of course a conjunction. And then we have I served it on the defendant. So I is the subject, served is the verb, and it is the object because that was the thing that was served. So that sentence could be a sentence in its own right. I served it on the defendant. It can stand alone as a sentence and that makes it a principal clause. So both the phrase appearing before the word and the phrase after, both of those are principal clauses. Now, why is it important that you know that? Well, understanding this will prevent drafting errors such as comma splices, which we'll look at in next week's materials, and dangling clauses, which appear in the materials for this week. Make sure you look at those in the study guides. So quite often in failing to identify whether we have a principal or subordinate clause, it produces subsequent errors in the drafting process. Moving on to conjunctions, they are some of the most common words in the English language. They include and, but, because, if, and when. They take two clauses, whether they're subordinate or principal clauses doesn't matter. They take two clauses and connect them together in one sentence. However, as the study guide explores, it's important to make sure that you use the correct connector, the correct conjunction in the circumstances. The use of the wrong connector can significantly impact on the way that the legal document is read. So make sure that you carefully read through the list of examples and the list of connectors provided in the study guide and see how they impact on the meaning of the sentence. That will make you more alert to selecting the correct conjunction in the circumstances for your drafting task. So top tip for this week as you start the process of learning how to draft documents relates to verb nominalizations. Say that 3 times in a row and see if you don't get your brain and tongue confused. This is a common issue that we regularly see in students' work. A verb nominalization is really just a fancy way of saying that you've taken a verb and you've turned it into a phrase that includes a noun or the noun equivalent of the verb. So if we take the verb to agree, in a sentence we might say something like, the parties agreed to the terms presented. To convert that into a verb nominalization, we would take the verb to agree and we would turn it into make an agreement or enter into an agreement. So you see we've converted agree into agreement. So agreement becomes the noun and you now have to find a new verb to make the sentence make sense. Agreement on its own doesn't make sense unless you have to make an agreement or to enter into an agreement. In this case, it makes the sentence much longer. So the sentence becomes, the parties entered into the agreement on the terms presented. That's much more complex than the parties agreed to the terms presented. If you do that regularly, you're actually adding a lot of words to your document and making the sentence more complex, which means that it's more challenging for the reader to digest what you're saying. It's therefore contrary to the principles of plain English drafting. In our final slide for this week, we're going to look at some other common drafting errors. And these are errors that we see both in students' work and actually even in legal documents as well. The first is the issue of the collective noun. A collective noun involves one that denotes a group of people or a group of things or a group of animals. So it is both familiar to us as a body, so as one entity, but also as a group made up of individuals or made up of a number of things. And that therefore means that it's this hybrid between a singular entity and a plural. And so because of that, we often see a lack of agreement in a sentence between a verb and a pronoun that refers back to the original collective noun. So an example is on the slide there. You can see it says the government is reviewing the recommendations and their response will be released next week. So isn't there a highlighted in red to show that there is a lack of agreement here when they're both referring to the same thing, which is the government. So we've got singular in the use of the verb is, and then when we refer back to the government, the sentence uses the word their, which is plural. So we've got singular and plural in the same sentence, both referring back to the government. What's important is that we have agreement in that sentence. So we either need is and its, because they're both singular, or are and their. Now, generally, it doesn't matter whether you go for singular or plural as long as your sentence has agreement throughout. If you use it singular, use it consistently. If you use plural, use that consistently. However, sometimes you may intend to indicate the body, or you may really be talking about the members or individuals or things that make up the collective noun. So in those instances, you should select the correct verb and the correct pronoun to refer to what you intend to convey. Moving on to dangling clauses, these are particularly problematic because often a clause is not connected grammatically to another clause within the same sentence, and it can cause confusion in interpreting the relevant sentence. So you can see the example on the slide there. Following a failure to apply for an extension, Professor Smith applied the late penalty. Now, note that the words highlighted in red are the first clause, then there's a comma, and then a second clause follows in the same sentence. The first clause is problematic because it does not tell us who failed to apply for the extension. We have no indication of the subject in that sentence. And the problem with that is that the reader is left with only one choice, which is to infer that Professor Smith failed to apply for the extension, because Professor Smith is the only individual mentioned in the entire sentence. So Professor Smith is the only subject appearing in the entire sentence. And of course, you know that that's not correct. When you read that, you know that it's the student who has failed to apply for an extension, and Professor Smith is the lecturer applying the late penalty, but the sentence does not convey that to the reader. Now, while you might think that's not problematic because we read between the lines, we read into the gaps and it's fine, in a contract, if you have that, there may be a great deal of ambiguity as to what is meant. If you have a dangling clause in a contract, it may give rise to one side arguing a particular interpretation because it favours their client to do so, and that is contrary to your client's best interests, and so you end up in a dispute about how to interpret that relevant clause. As the intention of the parties is not relevant when the court determines how the contract should be read, and as evidence at the time of signature of the contracts is also not admissible, the court must adopt an objective interpretation of the words And this can, of course, lead to an outcome that your client does not want and certainly didn't foresee. So while this is perhaps not fatal in academic writing such as law essays and problem questions, it can be problematic in legal documents, particularly those that create rights and obligations on the parties. Because if you had a dangling clause that mirrors this, you wouldn't be sure who the first clause was referring to and therefore who had that obligation or right. That brings me to the end of this video for this week. Please make sure you thoroughly read the study guide and concentrate on the examples presented to help you get to grips with the rules of grammar that we have explored in this module. Please make sure you attempt the task before the workshop and bring your draft with you. I'll see you then.